She spent millions building the most extravagant villa in town, but on the night of her big celebration, the rightful owner walked in, showed one piece of paper, and took it all. Cornell Banning didn't expect to see strangers on his land that Tuesday morning. He was driving back from a supply run at Home Depot, coffee still warm in the cup holder, when he spotted three men in neon vests hammering stakes into the soil his grandfather had once plowed with his own hands. The lot wasn't much to look: an acre of dry Texas earth fenced with rusting wire, a patch of mesquite trees shading the far corner, but to Cornell, it was family ground. He slowed his truck and pulled over on the gravel shoulder, staring. A white pickup with a contractor's logo sat near the property line, tailgate down, rolls of blueprints spread across it. A woman in a tailored beige blazer stood beside the men, pointing, nodding, giving orders like she owned the place. Cornell stepped out of his truck, boots crunching against gravel, and called out, "Excuse me? What do you think you're doing?" The woman didn't flinch. She turned, chin tilted high, dark sunglasses masking her eyes. "Surveying," she said flatly, like he should have known. "This is my land," Cornell replied, his voice low but sharp. "Banning property. Has been for 3 generations." One of the workers glanced at the woman, uncomfortable. She didn't waver. "It's unused," she said, dismissing him with a flick of her hand. "We're assessing it for community development, a project that will raise everyone's property values." Cornell's jaw clenched. "You didn't ask me." "Nobody asked me." The men shifted uneasily, but the woman didn't blink. She walked closer, clicking across the dirt in heels that had no business out here. "Mr. Banning, is it? I'm Judith Merrow, president of the Willow Bend HOA." Her voice carried the same tone a teacher might use on a child. "This is about progress. About lifting this neighborhood into what it was always meant to be. You'll see." Cornell stared at her, trying to steady the anger rising in his chest. You don't touch a man's land without his say. You don't erase history for your own vision. Judith smiled, but it was thin and sharp. History doesn't pay the bills. And frankly, your acre is an eyesore. We are correcting that. One of the workers coughed, avoiding Cornell's gaze. Another started re-rolling the blueprints as if he wanted no part of the confrontation. But Judith lifted her chin higher, radiating confidence. Cornell's voice dropped. "My grandfather used to say, 'The land remembers who walks it.' You're not walking it with respect." For the first time, Judith's smile faltered, just slightly. Then she waved him off like a nuisance. "Lawyers can argue later. Right now, we build." Cornell didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply turned back to his truck, sat behind the wheel, and gripped the steering wheel tight enough that his knuckles whitened. He could have called the police right then, could have driven straight to the courthouse and filed an injunction. But something in him said, "Wait. Watch. Let her think she's in control." He watched her gesture broadly to the men. Watch them hammer more stakes. Watch the boundaries of his family's land get swallowed by arrogance. The sight cut deep, but it also lit a strange spark inside him. She thought she'd won already. She thought her title and her blazer and her confidence would erase his name from the deed. Cornell started his truck, the engine rumbling beneath him. He took one last look at the acre, his acre, and at Judith Merrow, standing there like a queen giving orders. He drove off without another word, but a plan had already begun to take root in his mind. He wouldn't stop her, not yet. But if she wanted to pour millions into a palace on his soil, he'd let her dig the hole deeper first, long before surveyors showed up with tape measures and neon vests. The acre in Plano carried weight in Cornell Banning's family. His grandfather, Elijah Banning, had bought it in the late 1940s after returning from the war. It wasn't prime real estate back then, just a stretch of dusty soil at the edge of a modest farming community. But to Elijah, it represented permanence, Place where no landlord could knock on the door and say time's up. Cornell grew up walking those lines of wire fence with his grandfather, who taught him how to fix sagging posts with little more than grit and baling wire. Elijah would say, "Boy, dirt's the one thing they ain't making more of. You guard it. You honor it." Those words stayed lodged in Cornell's mind, even after he grew up, left for college in Oklahoma, and built a career in logistics that kept him traveling across states more than he stayed home. When Elijah passed, the land went to Cornell's father. And when his father died, it came to Cornell. By then, Plano had changed. New homes sprouted where cornfields once stood, and developers eyed every patch of unused earth like wolf-scenting prey. But Cornell never sold. Not because the lot was making him rich in truth. It sat empty, barely paying its property tax bills each year, but because it was his grandfather's fingerprint on the world. He'd park his truck there sometimes after long days, shut off the engine, and just sit in the quiet. He'd remember Elijah's calloused hands, the smell of tobacco on his shirt, the steady voice that told him a man's dignity was tied to what he protected. To outsiders, it looked like neglected land. To Cornell, it was a ledger of his family's endurance. The neighborhood around it grew more polished as years passed. Fences turned into stone walls, yards manicured into glossy perfection. The HOA came into power, declaring rules about mailbox colors, lawn heights, even what curtains could show from the street. Cornell never joined. His land wasn't part of their tract housing. He stayed separate, on his own ground, uninterested in their newsletters and their so-called community pride. But that separation was exactly what made his acre stand out to HOA eyes. It looked like a blemish. To Judith Morrow, it looked like an opportunity. Cornell didn't know much about her then, not beyond the whispers neighbors shared. They said Judith had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, pushing residents to repaint homes, install matching shutters, and replace flower beds that didn't fit her vision. She wasn't just president. She was the face of the neighborhood, the kind of person who believed every street sign and garden hedge reflected her. That's why, when Cornell saw her that first day on his property, clipboard in hand, he understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't just trying to build something. She was trying to erase his family's history and write her own name over it. Asterisk that night. Cornell drove to his mother's old house and pulled out the deed papers he kept in a fireproof box. He traced his finger over his grandfather's signature, bold and steady, and felt a wave of anger surge in his chest. But behind the anger came clarity. He had the law on his side. He didn't need to shout or throw fists. He just needed patience. The land had taught him that. Patience. You don't harvest the same day you plant. You wait. You let things grow. And sometimes you let your opponent think they're ahead because the fall will be harder when truth hits. Still, it hurt. Every childhood memory he had of running through tall grass with cousins. Every story his father told him about. Elijah buying the acre with cash he'd saved from factory shifts, all of it felt under siege now. Someone was treating it like an empty canvas, when for him it was a full book already written. Cornell sat at his kitchen table late into the night, coffee cooling by his hand, the papers spread out before him. He wasn't just defending dirt. He was defending legacy. But legacy alone wouldn't stop bulldozers. And soon, he realized, the fight would get louder, dirtier, and far more public. Judith Merrill wasn't the kind of woman who settled for second place. At 49, she had carved out a reputation in Plano's Willow Bend community as someone who could turn cracked driveways and sagging roofs into picture-perfect brochures for real estate agents. She wore it like armor. Crisp blazers, pearl studs, manicured nails, the image of control. To her, the HOA wasn't just a volunteer role. It was a throne. Neighbors whispered about her relentlessness. If your grass grew too long, Judith sent a letter. If your shutters didn't match the approved color palette, you'd hear about it. If your Christmas lights lingered past January 5th, she'd threaten fines. To some, she was exhausting. To others, she was a force of order, the reason property values kept climbing. Judith preferred the latter description, but one piece of land irritated her every time she drove past it, that lone acre owned by Cornell Banning. She called it the sore thumb of Willow Bend. The grass grew wild, fences leaned, and no house stood there to match the neighborhood's tidy rhythm. To Judith, it wasn't heritage. It was wasted space. She'd spoken about it during HOA meetings. "Imagine," she said once, pacing in front of a room of homeowners seated in folding chairs. "That lot could hold the crown jewel of our neighborhood. A landmark property, something that elevates all of us." Her voice carried conviction, and though a few residents shifted uneasily, no one wanted to challenge her. Judith had a way of turning disagreement into social exile. Behind closed doors, she nurtured the idea like a seed. She hired an architect from Dallas to draft concepts. She toured homes in Highland Park, scribbling notes about imported tiles and archways. When she saw photos of a villa in Scottsdale with sweeping verandas and a reflecting pool, she clipped them into a folder labeled Marrow Project. She envisioned more than a house. She imagined a Cimbala Mediterranean-style villa worth $6 million. Sitting like a monument in the middle of Plano, with her name whispered every time neighbors pointed to it. In her mind, the HOA presidency wasn't enough anymore. She wanted a legacy carved in stone and marble. Judith justified her plan with economics. A home that grand would raise the bar, she argued. It would attract wealthier families, push property values up, and make the whole neighborhood more desirable. She told herself she was doing everyone a favor, though at the core, it was vanity. She wanted something that said, "Judith built this." Her Ollie's a circle of neighbors who both feared and admired her fed her confidence. At a wine and cheese gathering in her backyard, she held court. "Cornell doesn't even use that land," she said, swirling a glass of Chardonnay. "It's just sitting there, overgrown, wasted. He should be thanking me for improving it." A neighbor, a thin man named Gerald, mumbled, "But he owns it, doesn't he?" Judith flashed her sharp smile. Ownership is just paper. Progress is reality. By the time the villa is finished, who's going to care whose name is on some dusty deed? The group chuckled nervously. They weren't sure if she was joking. Judith didn't clarify. Meanwhile, she courted investors quietly. She promised them visibility, prestige, and bragging rights. "This isn't just a house," she told one Dallas developer over lunch. "It's a showcase. Everyone who drives through Willow Bend will see it, and no quality lives here." The developer raised an eyebrow. "And the owner of the land?" Judith waved her hand as though brushing crumbs off a table. "Handled. It's a formality. Trust me, once construction begins, there won't be any turning back." Her confidence was her weapon. She moved with the certainty of someone who believed rules bent for her. And with each conversation, with every sketch she approved, the vision grew sharper in her mind. Arched verandas catching the Texas sun. Polished stone imported from Italy. A reflecting pool mirroring the sky. She could practically hear the compliments already. But not everyone was convinced. At a neighborhood block party, Cornell overheard fragments of conversation. Someone mentioned Judith's big project like it was already a done deal. He kept his silence. The sound hit Cornell before the sight did the deep. Rhythmic thud of machinery pounding into the earth. He turned onto the street and felt his stomach tighten. There it was. A backhoe cutting into the soil his grandfather once walked. The acre was fenced off with temporary orange barriers, and workers in hard hats moved with a sense of urgency. Cornell parked his truck across the street and sat for a moment. Concrete trucks idled in line. Rebar glistened in the morning light. It was no longer just survey stakes. This was construction in full swing. He climbed out and walked straight across the road. A foreman noticed him and lifted a hand. "Sir, you can't be inside the barrier." Cornell ignored the warning. "Who gave you permission to build here?" His voice carried above the noise, sharp and direct. The foreman hesitated. "Talk to Miss Moreau. She's handling all approvals." Cornell didn't have to wait long. Judith arrived in her SUV, stepping out in slacks and heels as if she were arriving at a gala rather than a construction site. Her sunglasses reflected the chaos behind her. She smiled like the mess of machinery belonged to her. "Cornell," she said smoothly. "Good morning. What the hell do you think you're doing?" He shot back, his voice low but shaking with anger. "This is my family's property." "You can't just," Judith raised a hand, silencing him like a teacher correcting a child. "I've already explained this. This project benefits everyone. Look at the jobs. The investment. Do you want to hold back progress because you're sentimental about weeds and wire fencing?" Cornell's fists curled at his sides. "You're trespassing. This isn't just weeds. This is banning land. You don't erase history because it doesn't fit your brochure." A few workers slowed their pace, pretending to check blueprints, but really listening in. The tension hung heavy in the air. Judith leaned in slightly, her perfume cutting through the dust. "Then sue me," she said quietly. "But by the time the courts drag their feet, this villa will be finished. And once people see it, nobody will care who filed what paperwork." Cornell stared at her, fury in his eyes, but he didn't shout. "You're building a castle on quicksand, Judith?" She smirked. "Funny, it looks like solid ground to me." The foreman cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to move the conversation along. "Miss Merrow, we need your approval on the foundation lines." Judith turned away without another word, her heels clicking against the gravel. She didn't look back. Cornell walked back to his truck, each step heavier than the last. Neighbors had begun gathering along the sidewalk, whispering. A woman with a stroller glanced at him with sympathy, while an older man shook his head as if to say, "Don't fight her. You won't win." Later that evening, Cornell stood at the edge of the lot again. The forms for the foundation were already in place, wooden frames outlining where walls would soon rise. He could see the shape taking form, and the weight of what Judith was attempting pressed hard on him. His phone buzzed with a call from his cousin, Jerome, who lived a few miles away. "You seeing this?" Jerome asked. "I'm looking at it right now," Cornell said. "That woman's crazy. You gonna stop her?" Cornell's eyes followed the outline of the future villa, the workers laughing near the concrete mixer. "Not yet," he said slowly. "What do you mean, not yet?" "She's stealing your land, man." Cornell's grip tightened around the phone. Sometimes the best way to beat someone is to let them think they've won. Let her pour her pride and her money into this. Every brick she lays just makes my case stronger. There was silence on the line. Then Jerome sighed. "You sure about this?" Cornell nodded to himself. "I've never been surer." The following days proved difficult. Each time he drove past, the villa grew. Walls rose, steel beams went in, and trucks arrived with stacks of stone. Neighbors started talking openly, their voices carrying down the street. "I heard it's going to be worth $6 million. Can you imagine the parties?" Finally, someone's improving that land. Cornell clenched his jaw when he overheard it, but he stayed silent. He wasn't interested in rumors. He was watching, waiting, documenting every invoice, every shipment. Every square foot laid down without his consent. Judith paraded through the site daily, shaking hands with investors, praising workers, and smiling like a queen watching her palace rise. To her, Cornell was just background noise. To him, she was writing the first act of her own downfall. But with every beam that went up, the stakes grew higher and soon. Silence alone wouldn't be enough to hold back the storm. Cornell could have stormed into a lawyer's office that very week and filed a restraining order. He could have called the county, raised hell, demanded inspections, forced fines. But instead, he did the one thing Judith Merrow didn't expect. Nothing. At least, nothing that showed on the surface. Behind closed doors, Cornell was working. He pulled the deed from his fireproof box, scanned it into digital copies, and sent them to his attorney, a steady old friend named Paul Richter out of Dallas. Paul read the papers twice and said over the phone, "Cornell, this is airtight. Your name is on it. Your grandfather's signature before that. You've got a chain of ownership clear as daylight." Cornell leaned back in his chair, listening to the clatter of construction echo faintly even through his windows. "So if I take her to court, ... You'll win," Paul interrupted. "But it could drag on for months, maybe years, if she fights. You'll get the land back, sure. But if the house is finished by then, that gets complicated." Cornell rubbed his temples. "Complicated how?" "Well, technically, the structure belongs to the landowner once it's built on your property. That'd be you. But she screamed fraud, appeal, maybe even countersue for damages. It'll be a mess. Costly, too." Cornell stayed silent for a long moment. "Then I wait," he said finally. "Wait," Paul repeated, surprised. "Let her hang herself. Every dollar she spends, every brick she lays. When the dust settles, it's mine. All of it." Paul whistled low. "That's cold-blooded, Cornell." "It's patient," Cornell corrected. And so he waited. Every morning he drove past the site, sometimes slowing his truck just enough to see the progress. Workers poured concrete, laid rebar, set scaffolding. He took photos from the road, time-stamped them, saved them into folders. Neighbors thought he was powerless, but in truth, he was building a record as steady as the foundation going into the dirt. The hardest part was keeping his anger in check. On more than one occasion, he felt the urge to march onto the lot and shut everything down himself. But he remembered his grandfather's words, "Land teaches patience, boy. You can't rush the harvest." One evening, he stopped at a gas station and overheard two construction workers grabbing sodas inside. "Man, this place is something else," one said. "Imported stone? Custom? Everything. Heard it's going to be worth 6, maybe 7 million. The other chuckled. "Can you believe the HOA president just grabbed the land like that? Bold man." Real bold. Cornell pretended not to listen, paid for his coffee, and walked out. His truck door slammed harder than he intended. The workers thought it was bold. He thought it was theft. Still, he said nothing. Judith, meanwhile, grew louder. She hosted walkthroughs for donors, even when the place was only beams and scaffolding. She stood on plywood floors and high heels, gesturing with manicured hands at unfinished walls. "Here's the grand hall," she told a small group one Saturday. Her voice echoing against exposed studs. Double staircase. Custom railings flown in from Italy. Picture it. This will redefine Plano. A woman in the group gasped. "It's incredible, Judith. Absolutely incredible." Judith beamed. "It's not just for me. It's for all of us. Property values will rise across the board. You'll thank me when you sell." Cornell, standing just beyond the temporary fence, caught her eye for the briefest moment. Her smile faltered, but she quickly turned back to her audience. He tipped his hat in her direction, calm, steady, as if to say, "I see you. Keep going." And she did. As weeks turned into months, the villa climbed higher. Roof tiles gleamed in the Texas sun, the reflecting pool began to take shape, and chandeliers arrived in crates marked fragile from overseas. Judith walked the site like a monarch inspecting her palace. Cornell stayed in the shadows, watching, waiting, collecting evidence, Neighbors began whispering that maybe he had given up. Some thought he'd sold the land quietly, that Judith had bought him out. Others said he didn't have the fight in him. They were wrong. Cornell wasn't surrendering. He was sharpening his blade. Every day Judith spent flaunting her power, she was building not just a house, but her own downfall, brick by brick. But even patience has limits, and as the villa neared completion, the tension between them was about to boil over in public. By late spring, the acre barely resembled the patch of dirt Cornell had grown up knowing. Where his grandfather once walked with a shovel slung over his shoulder, marble tiles now glistened in the sun. Trucks pulled in daily, delivering Italian stone, custom woodwork from Oregon, and crates so large they had to be lifted with cranes. The house was no longer a skeleton of beams. It had a face, now a looming Mediterranean villa that towered over the neighborhood. Cornell drove past in his truck every morning, sometimes slowing enough to watch workers lay stone or fit glass into arched windows. He took photos discreetly, time-stamped them, and saved them into his growing archive. To anyone else, he looked like a man defeated, standing on the outside of a dream he couldn't stop. But Cornell knew the truth. This was evidence. Every dollar Judith spent, every imported chandelier she hung, was a nail in her own coffin. Neighbors started to talk openly now. Judith hosted casual gatherings on the site, offering wine and hors d'oeuvres even before walls were finished. She walked guests through unfinished hallways, pointing to where a gallery wall would hang or where the grand staircase would curve. $6 million minimum, she told them with confidence. This is going to be the crown jewel of Plano. Everyone benefits. You'll see your home values jump overnight. Cornell stood across the street one Saturday when she was mid-tour. He leaned against his truck, arms folded, listening to the chatter of neighbors gasping at imported fixtures and French doors. A woman's voice carried across the lot. "Judith, this is stunning. Absolutely stunning." Judith's heels clicked against the marble as she replied, "It's vision, Barbara. Some people can't see it, but I can." Her eyes flicked toward Cornell then, just for a moment. She didn't speak his name, but her smirk carried enough message. "You've already lost." That night, Cornell met his cousin Jerome for dinner at a barbecue joint off US 75, over brisket and iced tea. Jerome shook his head. "Man, I don't know how you stand it. I'd have chained myself to a bulldozer by now." Cornell sliced into his brisket slowly. "Let her build." Jerome frowned. "She's showing off like it's hers." Cornell set his fork down. "That's the thing, Jerome. It isn't. Every imported brick, every square foot of polished stone, it's being planted in my soil. She doesn't see it, but she's decorating my house for me." Jerome leaned back, letting out a low whistle. The grand celebration was Judith Merrow's masterpiece. On the night of the gala, the villa was no longer a construction site, but a vision realized. Light blazed from every archway, spilling onto the manicured lawns and glinting off the serene surface of the reflecting pool. A string quartet played in the grand hall, its notes weaving through the chatter of Plano's most influential residents. Judith, resplendent in a cobalt blue gown, moved through the crowd, accepting compliments with a practiced, gracious smile. This was her apex. The sore thumb had been transformed into her crown jewel. Across the street, sitting in the dark cab of his pickup, Cornell Banning watched the spectacle. He wore a simple, clean button-down shirt and a pair of dark jeans, the closest thing to formal wear he owned. On the passenger seat lay a single, weathered folder. Inside was the original deed, its paper crisp and its language unequivocal. The time for waiting was over. The harvest had come. He stepped out of the truck, the folder in his hand, feeling not heavy, but right. He crossed the street, his boots making no sound on the paved asphalt. A stark contrast to the crunch of gravel from that first day. He walked past the valets, past the guests sipping champagne on the veranda, and straight through the grand arched front door. For a moment, he just stood inside the threshold, taking in the scene. The imported marble, the custom ironwork, the glittering chandelier, it was all as garish and foreign to the land as he had imagined. The crowd's chatter began to die down, eyes turning to the silent, unfamiliar man in work boots who stood so commandingly in the doorway. Judith spotted him from across the room. Her smile tightened, but her confidence didn't break. This was a minor disruption, a pest to be swatted away. She excused herself and glided towards him, her smile a thin warning line. "Cornell," Sue said, her voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for him. "This is a private event. You weren't invited. You need to leave." He didn't raise his voice. It carried with the quiet force of truth, cutting through the music and the murmurings. "I don't need an invitation to walk on my own land." A few people nearby overheard and fell silent. Judith's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound. "Not this again. We are well past that. If you have a grievance, take it up with the lawyers on Monday. Now, please, don't make a scene." "The scene was already made," Cornell replied, his gaze sweeping over the vaulted ceiling. "You made it. You built it. But you built it on my land." He didn't wait for her retort. He stepped past her into the center of the grand hall. The string quartet faltered and stopped. Every eye was on him. He could feel Judith's furious gaze burning into his back. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and steady, echoing in the sudden quiet. "My name is Cornell Banning. My grandfather, Elijah Banning, bought this acre of land in 1947. He taught me to guard it, to honor it." He held up the folder, then slowly drew out the single most important piece of paper. He unfolded it, the sound stark in the silence. "This is the deed. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. It has never been sold. It was never given away." A wave of confused murmuring rippled through the crowd. People looked from Cornell's unwavering face to Judith's, which was rapidly losing its color. "This is nonsense." Judith snapped, her voice shrill. "A stunt. Security." "Call them," Cornell said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Then call the county clerk. The record is public. It always has been. You were just too proud to look." He turned back to the crowd, his message now for the investors, the neighbors, the people who had admired Judith's vision. Every piece of marble, every pane of glass, every dollar spent on this palace was spent on Banning land. You built it for me. Asterisk, the truth, simple and unassailable, landed in the room with the weight of a stone. The illusion shattered. The grandeur of the villa suddenly seemed like a desperate, fraudulent costume. The guests began to back away from Judith, as if her failure were contagious. A man in an expensive suit, one of the Dallas investors, stepped forward, his face ashen. "Judith, what is he talking about? You assured us the land was handled." Judith was speechless, her mouth opening and closing, her kingdom crumbling around her heels. Cornell looked at the investor, then at the foreman who stood near the kitchen, his hard hat in his hands. "The workmanship is fine," Cornell said, his tone almost conversational. "The house is well built. It's just on the wrong lot." He folded the deed and placed it back in the folder. He turned to leave, his business finished. The party was over. "You can't just—" "This is my home." Judith finally cried out, the words a strangled plea. Cornell paused at the door and looked back at her, and for the first time there was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, weary pity. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "It's mine." He walked out into the quiet Texas night, leaving behind a silence louder than any celebration. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, but they were a formality. The law was unequivocal. The villa and the land it sat on belonged to Cornell Banning. He didn't gloat. He didn't sell. He moved into the grand villa, not as a conqueror, but as a steward. He placed a framed photo of his grandfather, Elijah, on the grand marble mantelpiece. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit on the veranda, the very one Judith had proudly shown off, and look out over the acre. The land, now covered in stone and tile, was different, but its soul was the same. He could still feel the memory of his grandfather walking it. He had guarded it. He had honored it. And in the end, the land had provided, as it always did, for those who knew how to wait. The castle hadn't been built on quicksand after all. It had been built on Banning soil, and that made all the difference.